There is a particular kind of horror that does not announce itself with violence or chaos, but instead emerges gradually, quietly embedding itself into the fabric of everyday life, until the familiar becomes uncertain and the ordinary begins to feel like a carefully constructed illusion. And it is within that fragile space between certainty and doubt that the most disturbing stories take root. Because once the mind begins to question what it knows, there is very little that can be trusted again. In the early months of 2025, in a well-established residential district known for its orderly streets and long-standing families, a case began to unfold that would challenge not only the understanding of those involved, but also the very notion of identity itself, leaving behind a trail of evidence that was as perplexing as it was deeply unsettling. The case began, as many do, with a report that seemed at first almost trivial. A woman named Ananya Sharma walked into a local police station and stated, with a calmness that bordered on detachment, that her husband had been replaced. Not missing, not harmed, replaced. The officers who received her statement initially interpreted it as a sign of distress, perhaps the result of emotional strain or psychological fatigue. And yet, there was something about the precision of her words, the way she articulated her observations without hesitation or contradiction, that made it difficult to dismiss her claim entirely. She insisted that the man living in her home, the man who shared her bed, her meals, and her daily routines, was not the same person she had married. And while she acknowledged that he looked identical in every observable way, she maintained that there were differences, subtle at first, but increasingly impossible to ignore. It was not just behavior, it was not mood, it was something deeper, something fundamental. She described it as an absence, as though the person she knew had been removed, leaving behind only a precise imitation. At first, her account was met with skepticism, as such claims often are. And yet, protocol required that a basic welfare check be conducted, if only to ensure that there was no immediate threat or underlying issue that warranted intervention. When officers visited the Sharma residence, they found nothing overtly alarming. The house was orderly. There were no signs of struggle. And the man in question, Rajiv Sharma, greeted them with a composed and cooperative demeanor, answering questions with clarity and providing no indication that anything was amiss. He acknowledged his wife's concerns, attributing them to stress, and suggesting that she had been under considerable pressure in recent months, a statement that, on its own, seemed plausible. And yet, as the officers prepared to leave, one of them made a note, not of something that had been said, but of something that had not. An absence of warmth, an absence of spontaneity, an absence of the small, unconscious behaviors that often define familiarity. It was not enough to act upon, but it was enough to remember. Days passed, and Ananya returned. Her insistence had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified. She began to provide specific examples, moments where the man she lived with had failed to recall shared experiences, instances where his responses felt rehearsed rather than genuine, and details that, while minor in isolation, formed a pattern when considered collectively. She spoke of a birthday he did not remember, a habit he no longer had, a phrase he used differently. Each observation on its own could be explained. Together, they suggested something else, something far more difficult to define. It was at this point that investigators began to take a closer look, not because they believed her claim in its literal sense, but because the persistence of her account, combined with the subtle irregularities observed during their initial visit, warranted further examination. Background checks revealed no immediate discrepancies. Rajiv Sharma's identity was consistent across official records, his employment history aligned with his statements, and there was no evidence of fraud or impersonation. However, when investigators extended their inquiry to include medical records, they discovered something that had not been disclosed: a recent hospitalization. Approximately 6 weeks prior to Ananya's first report. The reason listed was a minor accident, no significant injuries, no cause for concern. And yet, the timing was notable, because it coincided almost exactly with the point at which Ananya claimed the changes had begun. When questioned about the incident, Rajiv's account was straightforward. He described a fall, a brief stay in the hospital, a recovery without complications. But when investigators requested access to the hospital's internal records, they encountered resistance. Not a refusal, but a delay. Documents that took longer than expected to retrieve. Staff members who seemed uncertain about details that should have been easily accessible. And within that hesitation, a sense that something was being withheld. What they eventually obtained was incomplete. Certain files were missing, others appeared altered, and among the documents that remained, there was a discrepancy, a time gap, a period of approximately 12 hours during which Rajiv's location within the hospital could not be accounted for. It was during this gap that the case began to shift. What had initially appeared to be a domestic concern now carried the weight of something far more complex, something that extended beyond the boundaries of a single household and into a space where intent and identity intersected in ways that were both deliberate and concealed. Surveillance footage from the hospital was reviewed. Most of it was unremarkable. Patients moving through corridors, staff attending to routine duties. But within the footage, there were moments where Rajiv could be seen, and then not seen, as though he had entered areas that were not covered by cameras, areas that were not part of standard patient access. Further investigation revealed that these areas were restricted, accessible only to authorized personnel. The question then was not just where he had gone, but why. As investigators pursued this line of inquiry, they uncovered a connection that would alter the trajectory of the case entirely. A research unit operating within the hospital, unofficial, unregistered, funded through channels that were difficult to trace. Its stated purpose, according to the limited documentation available, was the study of cognitive behavior and memory retention, though the scope of its activities appeared to extend far beyond what had been formally approved. Among the individuals associated with this unit was a man named Dr. Kunal Bedi, a neurologist with a reputation for unconventional methods and a history of research that had, on more than one occasion, pushed the boundaries of ethical practice. When approached for questioning, Dr. Bedi denied any involvement beyond standard medical procedures, stating that Rajiv had been treated for minor injuries and discharged without incident. But inconsistencies in his account, combined with the growing body of circumstantial evidence, began to erode the credibility of his statements. It was Ananya, however, who provided the detail that would bring everything into focus. She described a moment, late one evening, when she had asked her husband a question, a simple one, about a memory they shared, and when he responded, she noticed something she could not ignore. Not what he said, but how he said it. The phrasing was correct, the details were accurate, and yet the emotion was absent. It was as though he was recalling information rather than experiencing it, as though he knew the memory but had not lived it. This distinction, subtle as it was, became the foundation upon which the final phase of the investigation was built, because it suggested not a loss of identity, but a reconstruction of it, a version that had been learned, replicated, rehearsed. Under mounting pressure, the truth began to emerge, not in a single confession, but in fragments, documents, testimonies, data logs that had been overlooked. Together, they revealed a project that had been conducted in secrecy, one that sought to explore the possibility of behavioral replication through neurological intervention, using memory mapping and cognitive restructuring as tools to create a controlled version of an individual's identity. Rajiv Sharma had been a subject. Whether by choice or coercion remained unclear. What was certain, however, was that something had been done. Something that had altered not his appearance, not his physical presence, but the very structure of his mind. The man who returned home after the hospital was, in every measurable way, Rajiv. And yet, he was not. Because the continuity of experience, the intangible essence that defines a person beyond their physical form, had been disrupted, replaced with something that could imitate, but not originate. Dr. Kunal Bedi was arrested, the research unit was dismantled, and the case was closed, officially categorized as a criminal investigation involving unauthorized experimentation and identity manipulation. But for Ananya, the resolution offered no comfort, because the question that remained could not be answered by law or logic. If the man she lived with was not her husband, then where was the original? And if he was, then what had been taken from him? Because sometimes, the most disturbing truths are not the ones that involve violence or disappearance, but the ones that challenge the very nature of who we are, and whether that identity can be changed, altered, or even replaced without leaving a trace. And sometimes, the person sitting across from you is no longer the person you once knew.